They humiliated the quiet farmer, but a week later, every Apache scout watched their homes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. In the wide, dusty plains of the American West, a man named Joshua lived alone on his small farm, tucked away at the edge of town. He was the kind of person that no one noticed, quiet, humble, and always keeping to himself. The townspeople hardly ever paid him any attention, especially not after his wife and children had passed years ago. His farm was modest, his crops were basic, and his animals few. But he worked diligently, rising early each day to tend to his land. Little did he know that the tranquility he had built for himself would soon be shattered by a single act of cruelty. One afternoon, as Joshua was mending a fence by the road, a group of local men rode by. They were young, brash, and looking for trouble. They began to tease him, mocking his solitary life and the dust-covered farm that had barely made it through the harsh winters. They laughed as they called him weak and pitiful, a man who couldn't even defend himself. The insults came fast and harsh, their words cutting through the dry air like a whip. One of them, a man named Brett, grew bolder. He spat on the ground near Joshua and shoved him, causing him to stumble back. The others laughed louder. Joshua, quiet as ever, didn't fight back. He simply stood up, wiped the dust from his clothes, and looked them in the eye. The men rode off after a few more jeers, leaving Joshua standing there, his heart heavy with the sting of humiliation. The townsfolk, having witnessed the scene from a distance, whispered among themselves. Some were amused, others indifferent. But no one came to Joshua's aid. They all saw him as just another lonely farmer, too weak to be of any consequence. But Joshua wasn't the man they thought him to be. He went back to his home that evening, but instead of wallowing in his humiliation, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this pass. Joshua knew that the land of the West, his labor. That night, as he prepared to sleep, he heard the sound of hooves in the distance. It was a familiar sound, one he had once ignored, but now, it seemed to carry a different weight. The men who had humiliated him were coming back. But this time, they were not just mocking him. They were coming for a reason. They rode in, confident, as though they expected Joshua to be just as defenseless as before. But this time, Joshua was ready. He had anticipated this moment, had prepared himself not to strike first, but to face the men with the calm strength he had earned. As they approached his farm, Joshua stepped out onto the porch, his stance unwavering. The men slowed their horses, seeing him for the first time with new eyes. Joshua's figure was different now, his shoulders broad, his eyes steady and unblinking. The leader of the group, Brett, was the first to speak, his voice dripping with arrogance. Well, if it isn't the quiet farmer, Brett sneered. You actually think you can stand up to us now? Joshua said nothing at first. He simply looked at them, letting the silence stretch between them. The men shifted uncomfortably, sensing something had changed. I didn't come here for a fight. Joshua finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. I came here for respect. Brett scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. He was no longer so sure of himself. Joshua's calm demeanor had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. The group of men began to dismount, one by one, each unsure of what to expect. It was then that the first Apache warrior appeared from the shadows, stepping silently into the light. The others followed, their eyes sharp, their movements calculated. They didn't speak, but their presence spoke volumes. The men from the town faltered, their bravado slipping away as they realized they were no longer facing a lonely farmer, but a man who had earned the respect of those who commanded power in these lands. Joshua remained still, watching them with steady eyes. This isn't about strength, Joshua said quietly, but his words carried weight. It's about honor. You can take that from me once, but not again. The men glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. They were no longer in control of the situation. In the silence that followed, Joshua made no move. He simply stood tall, surrounded by the warriors who had come to watch over him. They knew what the town didn't. Respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned. And Joshua had earned it. The men from the town stood frozen, their confidence slipping away as they saw the warriors gather around Joshua. They had expected to find the same farmer they had humiliated just days ago, but now they faced a man transformed. Joshua's calm presence, backed by the Apache warriors, had shifted the balance of power in a way they didn't know how to respond to. Brett, the leader of the group, cleared his throat, trying to regain some of the bravado he had once carried so easily. "You think you can scare us with these people?" he sneered, his voice wavering slightly. But Joshua remained silent, his gaze steady and unwavering. Behind him, the Apache warriors stood like shadows, their eyes watching the men with a cold intensity that spoke volumes. The tension was thick in the air, and for the first time, the men from the town felt a real fear creep into their hearts. The silence between them stretched on, unbroken. Then, in the distance, a horse's hooves echoed through the air, signaling the arrival of someone they hadn't expected. It was Marshal Voss, the town's lawman, riding in with his badge gleaming in the sunlight. The men from the town shifted nervously, hoping that their familiar ally would restore some sense of order. As Marshal Voss approached, Joshua turned his head slightly, acknowledging the lawman's presence without a word. Voss dismounted, his gaze scanning the scene. He looked at the group of men, then at Joshua, then at the Apache warriors. His eyes lingered on the warriors, their stoic expressions betraying nothing, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "What's going on here?" Voss asked, his voice commanding but laced with hesitation. Joshua finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to claim the respect that was denied to me," he said, his words carrying a quiet weight. "These men think they can humiliate me, but they don't understand what happens when you break a man's spirit and expect him to stay broken." Marshal Voss looked at the men from the town, their expressions betraying their guilt, and then back at Joshua. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the balance had tipped, and he knew there was no going back. He had seen enough in his years as a lawman to recognize when things were about to escalate beyond his control. Brett stepped forward, trying once again to assert himself. "We don't need to listen to this, Marshal," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This is our town, and we do things our way. This farmer is nothing." Joshua didn't flinch. "You've said enough," he replied. His words were not a challenge, but a statement of truth. And with those words, the Apache warriors, who had been silent until now, took a single step forward, their movement in perfect unison. The sight of the warriors, their presence commanding and unyielding, made Brett and the others shrink back. The lawman, Marshal Voss, felt the weight of the moment. He could either stand by and watch, or he could intervene. But as he looked at Joshua, standing there with the Apache warriors at his side, Voss knew this was no longer about law or order. This was about something deeper. This was about respect and the right to demand it. The men from the town stood in stunned silence as the realization settled over them. They had underestimated Joshua. They had assumed he was just another man to be ignored, a farmer too weak to fight back. But now, they saw the truth. Joshua was no longer the man they could push around. He was a man who had earned the respect of those who held power in this land, and they were going to have to reckon with that. Joshua didn't wait for them to make the next move. He had already made his stand. With the Apache warriors behind him, he turned and walked back to his farm, his steps steady and resolute. The town would remember this day, and the men who had once humiliated him would never forget the lesson they had learned. They had thought they could break him, but instead, they had made him stronger. And now, Joshua was more than just a farmer. He was a man who commanded the respect of those who once thought themselves invincible. In the days that followed Joshua's quiet victory, the town began to stir with whispers of the events that had transpired. Word had spread fast, and those who had once looked down on him now spoke with a newfound respect. The men who had humiliated him, including Brett, were no longer the town's heroes. They were now the subjects of hushed conversations, their reputations tarnished by their actions. As for Joshua, his life had changed in ways that he hadn't expected. The Apache warriors, who had watched over him, began to leave, their mission complete. But the bond between Joshua and the tribe was now unbreakable. They had seen his courage and resilience, and they had come to respect him as one of their own. It wasn't just the physical strength that they admired, but his inner resolve, the strength of character that had allowed him to stand up when others would have stayed silent. As the warriors departed, they left behind a gift, a symbol of their trust and respect. Joshua found a beautifully crafted necklace among his belongings, the stone at its center a deep turquoise. It was a token of their bond, a reminder of the week that had changed everything. But as much as he had gained from the Apache, Joshua knew that the real test was yet to come. It wasn't enough to simply earn respect. He had to live by it, to prove that he was worthy of the honor they had bestowed upon him. The following week, a new challenge arose. Marshal Voss, the lawman, came to Joshua's farm with news. There was trouble brewing in the town. The men who had once humiliated him, now backed into a corner, had started to rally support, whispering of revenge against the farmers who had challenged their authority. The town was divided, and the lawman was unsure of how to proceed. "You've earned the respect of the Apache," Voss said, his voice laced with doubt. "But the town is another matter. They still see you as an outsider, as a threat." Joshua looked at the lawman, his expression steady. "I don't need their approval," he said quietly. "I've learned that respect comes from within, not from the opinions of others." Voss nodded, but the concern in his eyes was clear. He had seen too many men like Joshua, men who stood tall for a time, only to be brought low by forces beyond their control. But Joshua was different. He had earned his strength not through violence, but through patience and humility. As the days passed, the tension in the town grew. The men who had once laughed at Joshua now found themselves on the defensive, unsure of how to handle the new man they had created. They had underestimated him, and now, the balance of power was shifting. Joshua did not seek conflict, but he would not be intimidated. He had learned the ways of the Apache, and he knew that sometimes, the greatest strength lay in choosing when to fight and when to stand back. It wasn't long before the inevitable confrontation arrived. The men who had humiliated him came to his farm once more, this time with their fists clenched and their faces set in determination. They had decided that Joshua needed to be put in his place. But Joshua stood firm, his eyes steady as they approached. "We've had enough of your silence," Brett spat, his voice thick with anger. "It's time you learned your lesson." Joshua didn't move. He didn't need to. The Apache warriors had returned, this time standing behind him in silent solidarity. The men faltered as they saw the warriors, their eyes wide with fear. They had thought Joshua was alone, a weak farmer they could push around. But now, they saw something they had not anticipated. Joshua was not alone, and he was not afraid. The confrontation lasted only a few minutes, but the message was clear. Joshua had earned his place in this land, not through force, but through the respect he had gained from those who truly mattered. The men who had once humiliated him were left standing, unsure of what to do next. They had lost their power, and they knew it. Joshua had won, not through violence, but through the quiet strength that had always been within him. The days after the confrontation were filled with a quiet, but significant change in the town. Joshua's victory over those who had once humiliated him had sent ripples through the community. His strength, not just physical but moral, had won the respect of even those who had once dismissed him as a mere farmer. The Apache warriors, who had once stood by him as silent guardians, had now left his land, returning to their own people. But their bond with Joshua was far from over. As they departed, they had left behind their teachings, their customs, and their respect. Joshua felt the weight of that honor, and with it, the responsibility to live up to what he had become. The town, too, had changed in the wake of his transformation. The men who had once been his tormentors now avoided him. They had been humbled by their own failure, and Joshua's unspoken strength had become a quiet reminder of their weakness. But this peace was not to last. Tensions began to build again. The balance of power in the town had shifted, and some of the old leaders, who had once held sway, were not ready to let go of their control. They had watched Joshua's rise with suspicion, and now they saw him as a threat to their influence. As time passed, Joshua continued to work his farm, and though the respect from the townsfolk had grown, he knew that the real test of his transformation would come when the town's old power structures would challenge him once more. One afternoon, as Joshua was mending the fence at the edge of his land, he saw a figure approaching in the distance. It was Marshal Voss, the town's lawman, riding in alone. As Voss reached the farm, he dismounted, his face serious. "Joshua, we need to talk," Voss said, his voice grave. Joshua put down his tools, brushing the dirt from his hands. He knew that the lawman would not come unless it was important. What's happened? Joshua asked. Voss looked around before speaking. There's trouble brewing in town. Some of the old families, the ones who have always held power, they don't like how things have changed. They've been talking, and they're ready to push back. They don't trust you, Joshua. Joshua's face remained unreadable. He had expected this moment to come. It was inevitable. What do they want? He asked, his voice calm, steady. Voss shifted uncomfortably. They're demanding that you leave. They're saying your presence is a threat to the way the town has always been. They're not asking anymore. They're making it clear that they want you gone. Joshua knew the weight of those words. It wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about the shift in power that he had become a part of. What happens now? Joshua asked. Voss hesitated before answering. You have a choice. You can leave, quietly, and the town will return to the way it was, or you can stay and fight for your place here. But know this, it won't be easy. They're not backing down. Joshua stood tall, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had already fought for respect, and he had earned it. Now, it seemed, he would have to fight again, not with violence, but with something more enduring. He wasn't just protecting his land anymore. He was protecting everything he had worked for, the quiet dignity, the strength, the right to be treated as a man of worth. I'm not leaving, Joshua said, his voice firm, unwavering. I've earned my place here, and I'll fight for it. Marshal Voss looked at him, a hint of respect in his eyes. I thought you'd say that, he said quietly. Then I'll stand with you, Joshua. But you'll need more than just me if you're going to face them down. You'll need the people. Joshua nodded. He knew the fight ahead would not be an easy one, but it was one he was prepared for. The town had underestimated him once, and now, they would learn that he was no longer the quiet farmer they could push around. He was a man who had earned his place, and he would defend it with everything he had. As the days passed, Joshua prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation that would decide his future in the town. He had made up his mind. He wasn't leaving. His connection to the land, the strength he had earned, and the respect he had gained from the Apache warriors meant more to him than simply walking away. The town, however, wasn't going to let go so easily. The old families, the ones who had always held the reins of power, were not just going to step aside. They saw Joshua's rise as a threat to the status quo, and they were determined to put him back in his place. Joshua knew that his next steps would be crucial. Marshal Voss, the lawman, had offered his support, but Joshua needed more. He needed the people. He needed to prove that he wasn't just a man of strength, but a man who could unite the town behind him. As word spread of the rising tensions, Joshua began to talk to the people, one by one. He didn't seek confrontation. Instead, he spoke with quiet confidence, reminding them of the bond they shared, the respect they had for each other, and the value of standing up for what was right. The farmers, the laborers, and even the shopkeepers, those who had once looked the other way, who had once dismissed him as just another farmer, began to see him in a different light. They saw a man who had fought for respect, who had earned his place, and who was willing to fight again if necessary. But not everyone was convinced. Some were still afraid of the old families and the power they held. Some felt the pressure of conformity, unwilling to stand up against the established order. Yet, with each conversation, more and more of the townspeople began to rally around Joshua. They saw his resolve and felt the shift in the air. The day of the confrontation came sooner than expected. As Joshua stood at the edge of his farm, looking out at the horizon, he saw the town's old leaders approaching. They came in force, a group of wealthy landowners and influential figures who had once ruled the town with an iron fist. They were accompanied by a group of hired hands, their faces hard and unyielding. Joshua stood tall, his hands resting by his sides, a symbol of calm determination. As they approached, the leader of the group, a man named Thomas Blake, stepped forward. Blake had always seen himself as the voice of authority in the town, the one who kept things in order, or so he believed. His eyes narrowed when he saw the farmers and townspeople standing behind Joshua. This town belongs to people like us, Joshua, Blake said, his voice heavy with disdain. You may have earned their respect, but that doesn't mean you have a place here. Joshua didn't flinch. He had already said what needed to be said. This land belongs to everyone who tills it, who works it, who earns their living from it. Joshua replied, his voice calm and steady. I've earned my place here, and I'm not going anywhere. The tension in the air was palpable. Joshua's supporters stood firm behind him, but it was clear that the town's power struggle was far from over. Blake's gaze shifted to the group of Apache warriors who had quietly returned, standing at Joshua's side once more. It was a subtle reminder to Blake that this was no longer just about the old ways of the town. Joshua had earned the respect of those who had long been outsiders, and now they stood as his allies. Blake's lip curled in frustration, but he knew there was little he could do. The town had begun to change. The old guard could no longer hold its power through intimidation alone. "You've made your choice, Joshua," Blake said, his voice tight. "But you won't have peace here. We'll see to that." Joshua stood firm, unyielding. "Peace comes with respect," he said, his words carrying weight. "You can't demand it, Blake. You have to earn it." Blake didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for his men to step back, a silent signal of retreat. The confrontation was over for now, but Joshua knew the fight wasn't finished. The town was changing, but it was clear that the old ways were not going to give up without a fight. However, for the first time, Joshua felt that the town's heart was with him. It wasn't just about standing against the powerful few. It was about standing together for what was right. Joshua had earned more than just respect. He had earned the trust of the people who had once looked the other way. As the town's old leaders withdrew, Joshua stood tall, knowing that his journey was far from over, but also knowing that he had already won something far greater than a mere battle. He had won the respect of the land, the people, and the warriors who stood beside him. Weeks passed, and the town began to shift in ways Joshua had never imagined. The confrontation with the old families had left a mark, but the biggest change wasn't just the power dynamics. It was the growing respect from the townspeople. Those who had once quietly observed now spoke openly of the quiet farmer who had stood up to the established order. Some still held doubts, but many had come to see Joshua not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Joshua's bond with the Apache had deepened. He learned their ways not just as a student, but as an equal. They had shown him how to endure, how to adapt, and, most importantly, how to stand tall without seeking vengeance. He had found a quiet strength, one that came from within and from the support of those who truly understood him. But even as the town seemed to embrace the changes, not all were on board. Thomas Blake and his followers hadn't forgotten the humiliation they had endured, and they weren't ready to let go of their control. They watched from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. It wasn't long before that moment came. One crisp morning, as Joshua worked the fields, a rider approached him on horseback. It was Marshal Voss, his face grim. "Joshua, we've got trouble," Voss said, dismounting quickly. Joshua stopped what he was doing, sensing the weight of the situation. "What's happened?" he asked. Voss lowered his voice, making sure no one else was around to overhear. "It's Blake. He's stirring up trouble again. This time, he's rallying the ranchers, pushing them to reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. He's calling for your removal, permanently." Joshua took a deep breath. He had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. "What's the plan?" Joshua asked, his voice calm. "There's no official charge yet," Voss replied. "But Blake's convincing the townspeople that you've become a liability. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that someone will take matters into their own hands." Joshua nodded. He had been through this before, the threats, the intimidation. But now, he was no longer the same man who had cowered in silence. He had earned his place, and he wasn't about to back down. "I'll handle it," Joshua said, his resolve unwavering. "But I'll need your help." Marshal Voss looked at him, surprised. "You're asking for my help? You sure about that?" Joshua met his gaze, his eyes steady. "I've earned the trust of the people, and I've earned yours. But I can't do this alone. This is about the town's future, not just mine." Voss hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll do what I can, but it's not going to be easy." Joshua walked back to his farm that evening, his mind racing. He knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be won with force. It would require something much deeper, a commitment to fairness, to the community he had fought to protect. The next day, Joshua stood before the town hall, where a crowd had gathered. The air was thick with tension. Blake was there, his face twisted with anger, flanked by his followers. "You don't belong here," Blake spat, his voice carrying across the room. "This town was built by men like me, not someone like you." Joshua stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "This town belongs to all who work the land, who build it with their hands," Joshua said, his voice strong, but measured. It's not about who we were before. It's about who we are now, and what we can build together. The crowd shifted uneasily. Joshua knew that not all of them were convinced, but the words had struck a chord with more than a few. Blake sneered, but his voice faltered. You think they'll listen to you? You're just a farmer who thinks he's something more. Joshua didn't flinch. I'm not just a farmer, he said quietly. I'm a man who stands for what's right. And I'm not going anywhere. Blake's face reddened, his fists clenched, but Joshua stood firm. The crowd was watching, and Joshua knew this was his moment. You can't force respect, Joshua continued. You can demand obedience, but that's not the same thing. Respect has to be earned. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of Joshua's words. Blake glared at him, but there was nothing more he could say. The town was changing, and even he couldn't deny that. As the meeting came to an end, Joshua didn't wait for a victory. He simply walked out of the hall, knowing that the true fight wasn't about defeating Blake. It was about proving to everyone that strength comes from standing firm in your beliefs, not from trying to crush others. The people of the town, many of whom had once stood on the sidelines, began to approach him. They offered their support, their handshakes, and their thanks. They had seen the man who had stood up, not for himself, but for the community. And that was the true victory. The days that followed the meeting were filled with a palpable shift in the air. The town, which had once been a place of silent divisions, now seemed to hum with the energy of something new. Joshua's words had resonated with more people than he had expected, and though there were still those who clung to the old ways, the tide had undeniably begun to turn. He had faced down Thomas Blake and his supporters, not with force, but with unwavering conviction. And for the first time in years, the people of the town were beginning to see the value in standing together. Despite the growing support from the townspeople, Joshua knew the battle wasn't over. Thomas Blake and the other powerful families were not ready to relinquish their control, and they would not back down easily. But Joshua wasn't the man he once was. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but more importantly, he had learned the power of patience. The next week, Joshua was approached by some of the town's workers, those who had quietly supported him from the beginning. They had seen what he had done, how he had stood tall in the face of adversity, and they wanted to show their support. We're with you, Joshua, one of the men said, his voice steady. The town can't keep going like this. We're ready to stand with you. Joshua felt a swell of gratitude in his chest. These were the people he had worked alongside, the ones who knew what it meant to struggle, to fight for something better. And now, they were ready to fight for him. As the town continued to come to terms with the changing power dynamic, Blake and his followers retreated into the shadows, biding their time. They knew that Joshua's influence was growing, but they refused to acknowledge the reality that was unfolding. Blake's pride was too strong, and he refused to accept that the town might be ready for change. One evening, as Joshua was finishing his work on the farm, he heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. It was Marshal Voss once again, his face a mix of determination and concern. Joshua, we need to talk, Voss said, dismounting quickly. Joshua wiped his hands on his pants and looked at the lawman, sensing the urgency in his tone. What's going on? Joshua asked. Voss glanced around before speaking. Blake's not backing down. He's planning something. He's rallying the last of his supporters. They're not just going to fade away. They're coming for you, Joshua. And this time, it's not just words. It's action. Joshua felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had expected this moment, but he had never been one to shy away from a challenge. What do we do? Joshua asked. Voss paused for a moment, considering the best course of action. We stand together. The town's already behind you. You've proven yourself, Joshua. But we need to act fast before Blake can stir up more trouble. Joshua nodded, his resolve solidifying. This was the final test, the one that would determine whether his stand would be enough to reshape the town, or if the old powers would regain control. The next day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Joshua gathered the townspeople. They stood together, a group united by a common purpose. They had seen the truth in Joshua's words, and now, they were ready to make that truth a reality. The final confrontation would be one of words, not weapons. Joshua had no intention of allowing violence to define his fight. Instead, he would stand firm and demand the respect he had earned, not just for himself, but for the town. As night fell, Blake and his followers arrived at the town square. Their faces were hard, their eyes filled with defiance. They had come to take back what they believed was theirs. But as they stood before Joshua and the people who had gathered to support him, it was clear that this was not the same man they had faced before. Joshua stood tall, his posture unyielding, his gaze steady. "You can try to take control again, Blake," Joshua said, his voice carrying across the square. "But the people here have spoken. We are stronger together, and we will not be intimidated." Blake took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand," he growled. "This town isn't yours to control. You don't belong here." Joshua's gaze never wavered. "This town belongs to those who work it, who build it, who fight for it. And I've earned my place here. I've earned the right to be heard." Blake faltered. The words had struck a chord, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "You're just a farmer," Blake spat. "Nothing more." Joshua's voice softened, but his words held weight. "I'm more than a farmer. I'm a man who believes in fairness. And the people of this town have chosen that fairness over fear." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake and his followers stood still, their defiance crumbling in the face of Joshua's unwavering belief. This was the moment. Joshua had not only earned his place in the town, he had earned the future. The old powers had been broken, not through violence, but through unity, respect, and the quiet strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to fight for. As the days passed, Joshua watched as the town slowly began to rebuild itself, not just physically, but in spirit. The old divisions that had once defined the community began to fade, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. He had fought for his place in the town, and in doing so, he had shown the people what true strength meant. It wasn't in power or intimidation, but in standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Blake and his followers, once so confident in their control, had retreated into the background. Their influence in the town had waned, and the community had slowly moved forward. Joshua didn't seek vengeance, nor did he celebrate their downfall. He knew that the true victory was in the peaceful future that now lay ahead for the town, one that could be built on mutual respect and fairness. Marshal Voss, who had been a quiet ally throughout the struggle, came to visit Joshua one afternoon. The two sat together on Joshua's porch, overlooking the farm that had become a symbol of resilience. "You've done it, Joshua," Voss said, a rare smile on his face. "The town's finally coming together. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Joshua nodded, his gaze steady as he looked out at the horizon. "It's more than I ever expected," he said quietly. "But it's not just about me. It's about the people who stood with me. The ones who believed that we could change things, that we could make this place better." Voss took a deep breath, his eyes thoughtful. "You've earned your place here, Joshua. You've shown the town what true leadership looks like." Joshua smiled, though his eyes remained focused. It wasn't about being a leader. It was about showing the people that they had a voice, that they could stand together and make their own future. The conversation paused for a moment, and Joshua felt a deep sense of contentment. He had come to the town as an outsider, but he had fought for something that had never been given to him: the right to be heard, the right to be respected. Over the next several weeks, the town continued to heal. The wounds of the past weren't forgotten, but they were no longer the driving force of the community. People worked side by side, farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and laborers, all contributing to the prosperity that had once seemed out of reach. And through it all, Joshua remained the steady presence he had always been. He was no longer just a farmer, no longer the quiet man who had been pushed aside. He had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together, when they fought not for their own gain, but for the good of everyone. The Apache warriors, who had stood by Joshua during the darkest times, returned to their own people, but their bond with him remained unbroken. They knew the importance of what Joshua had achieved. It wasn't just the land he had defended, but the spirit of fairness and respect that now permeated the town. One evening, as Joshua sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and red, he felt at peace. The hard days were behind him, and though he knew that challenges would always arise, he now understood that they didn't have to be faced alone. The town had changed, but so had he. He was no longer the man who had kept to himself, who had suffered in silence. He was a man who had found his voice, and in doing so, he had given a voice to those who had once been silenced. He had earned his place, not through violence or vengeance, but through patience, resilience, and the willingness to fight for what was right. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Joshua knew that he had not only fought for his own future, but for the future of the town, a future built on respect, unity, and the quiet strength of a man who had never given up on the belief that things could be better. In the heart of the American West, a quiet farmer faces the challenge of earning respect in a town where power has long been held by a few. His journey of transformation is a tale of strength, resilience, and unity, as he stands up to the men who once humiliated him, proving that true leadership comes not from force, but from fairness and integrity. With the support of the Apache warriors, Joshua fights not only for his place in the town, but for the future of the community itself. This story echoes the timeless themes of Western stories, where individuals rise above adversity, showing that courage is the foundation of change. As Joshua's bond with the people of the town grows, and the Apache warriors silently watch over him, the lines between outsider and insider begin to blur. This powerful Western story highlights how a single person, standing firm in their beliefs, can challenge the status quo and shift the tide of history. With patience and perseverance, Joshua becomes a symbol of what it means to stand for what is right, and his victory resonates far beyond the boundaries of his farm. The story of Joshua is not just another chapter in Western stories. It is a testament to the power of unity, respect, and the enduring fight for justice in the American West. As his influence spreads, the town begins to heal, and Joshua earns his place in the legacy of Western stories, where honor and respect are the true rewards of a long, hard fight.